Good afternoon and welcome to the third event in our Beyond the Rails programme, celebrating 200 years of the modern railway. My name is Tessa Wordsworth and I'm Associate Director here in the rail team at Steer. Thanks for tuning into this conversation about the cost of Britain's railway, where we'll be exploring the financial pressures facing the industry and the potential impact of structural and funding reforms. I'm grateful to be joined by our guest, Paul Plummer, Professor in Rail Strategy, Director of University of Birmingham Centre for Rail Research and Education, and Academic Lead, UK Rail Research and Innovation Network. Paul, welcome. From my perspective, the rail industry is facing significant financial challenges, which will become all the more evident with the imminent conclusions of the Comprehensive Spending Review. There are critical decisions that need to be made to enable the industry to improve its financial position, how to improve the customer experience, where and how much to invest in the network, and identifying and delivering on realistic opportunities for efficiency. And yet the stand-up of GBR, a guiding mind to align incentives and make decisions which will deliver on these objectives, seems a long way away. This session is a spotlight on the issues the industry must take account of to deliver a more financially sustainable rail network. So Paul, could you start please by setting the scene for us? In your opinion, what are the key issues that need to be considered when looking at the railway?
Thank you, Tessa, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm not going to give you a load of numbers. I'm going to give you some things that I think are important to think about when looking at those numbers. So the first point I would always emphasise is the need to really have in mind the fundamental economics of the railway as a network and as a system, and with very long life assets. And this means, I think, that you have to look at the whole railway system when thinking about that, the track and the train. You have to look at the whole railway network, not individual lines. And you have to look at investment and performance over a number of years and not just a snapshot. And that may all sound supremely obvious, but I often see people not really doing that, which is why I like to emphasise it. The second point is also about sort of the economics in my terms and about emphasising the industry is ultimately still about people. It's delivered by people, for people, staff, customers and user benefits. So I think it's critical to have in mind when looking at finances to the customer benefits and the user benefits and to take those account. As a bare minimum, you need to be thinking about the whole industry P&L rather than separately cost and revenues. Again, something not always happens, but should happen. And you need to be aware as well of those wider benefits and also the public choices that are made about the balance between farebox revenues and subsidies. The flip side of all of that customer stuff is the stuff around the people running the industry. But I think in a half an hour chat, we haven't really got time to go into some of those workforce and industrial relations challenges just today. The third point I'd mention and introducing, though, is about industry finances have been challenging for very many years. They are perhaps more in the spotlight now, and that's more crystallised, but it's been a challenge for a long time. Despite that, there's been very considerable investment because governments for many years have recognised the value of doing so. So that's great. But post-COVID, we haven't yet got into a sustainable position in how we're marketing the railway and developing that. Volumes are recovered, but revenues below where we were. And that funding gap is having consequences for the money that's available for ongoing maintenance operations and renewal, while we're continuing to invest as well. So there's obviously a consensus about reform. And you mentioned that a minute ago, but the pace of implementation, I think, is holding back addressing some of those things, which would help to grow revenues, improve efficiency, and improve the financial position of the industry. Thank you, Tessa.
Thanks, Paul. You mentioned there sort of the importance of people, and the first event in our series, Beyond the Rails, looked at the customer experience and what needs to sort of secure a better experience for passengers and employees. How does that focus sort of intersect with the financial imperatives facing the industry?
Okay, there's often an assumption, I think, that improved customer experience is expensive. And obviously some things which we'd want to do to improve that experience would cost money. Certainly some things, for example, that would enable improve inclusivity and accessibility in many cases cost money, but even there, it's not always the case. We can do a lot, I think, by changing the organisation, hence the reform emphasis, to enable people to do what they know is right for customers. We can also do a lot to build on this by getting the right culture so that decisions really are based on what customers needs and eliminating waste, which doesn't improve that customer experience. Also, I think we can make much better use of data to drive collaboration and conversation. So if I think about data that's available now about how customers are using stations and how they're interfacing with the railway, sharing that much more broadly across the industry to enable collaboration, I think is powerful. But also data about the insights that different parts of the industry have about what customers want, and sharing that in a collaborative way, I think, can enable improvements. And as well as all of that, we've talked for many years about fares reform. There are some risks and uncertainty with change in that context, but actually, if that's done right, it can be used to generate value and reduce the net cost of the industry. So ultimately, I think a guiding mind can help to improve all of those things, to make the case for funding where it's needed, but to drive improvements where it doesn't actually cost anything.
Thanks, Paul. So picking up on that point about sort of GBR and the guiding minds, how important do you think the nationalisation of train operators and the creation of GBR is to delivering a more financially sustainable railway? And how does that relate to the policy of devolving more power to the regions?
Okay, so if most people would read just the newspapers, they believe that the biggest change being made is the nationalisation of train operators. And I'm not saying that ownership is unimportant or irrelevant, but it's certainly not the big issue here, I think. By far the bigger issue is the bringing together of track and train, both at a national level and that guiding mind, but also at a regional level, to be able to look at that joint P&L at those different levels and to make joined up decisions and empower people to look across that whole system. That's the big change, not nationalisation. And that's really important, but not still widely understood. I think that my view is that we can make progress with that quite quickly if the GBR chief executive and chair were empowered to shape Great British Railways now and to define how it should operate and start to empower people to operate in that new world. But that's not been the pattern so far, but hopefully that will change. I think that you mentioned devolution, which is really fascinating because it sounds like almost the opposite. And we've been talking about devolution for many decades, but there's now some sign of real progress on it and action, which I think is positive. And I think that you actually can have the best of both worlds. The railway is ultimately a national network, and certain things need to be done consistently nationally. Also, capacity is such a premium product that we need to use it carefully and make sure we allocate its use carefully. So those things do need to be done on a national basis. You need a strong system operator to get the best out of capacity and use it and make decisions and arbitrate between people where necessary. But you can do that, and at the same time, I think, have islands of multimodal integrated transport systems in major cities, as has been proved in London and other places. But I think that's the direction of travel of those multimodal city regions, joined up by a national rail network with sensible decision making about the use of scarce capacity.
Thanks. We're talking about scarce capacity and the point with GBR. How do you think GBR can sort of influence sustainable asset management? And also, do you think there should be continued investment to enhance the capacity of the network?
Okay, I'll start at the back of that because it links into the capacity piece. Because, I mean, I find it fascinating actually that a few years ago, not very long ago, all we were talking about was the need for more capacity. Any conference or seminar or things like this, it was all about we need more capacity, how are we going to get more capacity in more affordable ways. And then COVID happened, and all of a sudden it's as if we don't need capacity. And I think that's highly misleading. Of course, the volumes are different, the pattern of travels are different, but the requirements at peak are clearly are very similar. We need to get better at marketing and selling the use of the railway in other times, but actually the peak requirement is critical to our economy. So I do think we need to continue to make the case for investment. The best way of doing that is by delivering successfully. So the industry focusing on actually delivering successfully on its projects, and actually having a better understanding of why things cost what they do and where that is because of public choice rather than inefficiency. I think that's important. So yes, we need to continue to grow capacity and make a case for it because it's important for the economy and ever more important for the environment. But going back to the beginning of your question, then obviously we also need to improve the efficiency of how we look after and steward the railway as it is today. And there's clearly opportunity to do that. As I've said earlier, I believe that if there's progress on a guiding mind, then things can start to happen relatively quickly by empowering people to do what they know is sensible. We've seen initiatives like the local lines in Wales, which is a form of what we used to call alliancing, and effectively bringing all parts of the railway together at a local level to look at opportunities to improve efficiency, ultimately aligning to what the customer cares about. So I think there's huge opportunity there to improve efficiency. I also mentioned use of data in the context of customer experience, but it applies here as well. So one of the key initiatives, which I think is really excellent, of GBR or Network Rail between them, establishing a tool which provides a whole industry profit and loss view of different parts of the network. And I think that's really powerful in enabling the right conversations, even if you don't have perfectly aligned incentives, actually having a conversation about real data and what the real costs and potential revenues are from different decisions, I think is incredibly powerful, and it almost forces collaboration and removes some of the anecdotal things that come into those discussions. And obviously any tool like that, when you start with it, it's going to have some suboptimal data, rubbish data you might say, but that's sort of fine because it drives the right conversation, and if it's actually used, then the data will get improved. If it sits there being nobody using it, then nobody's going to bother improving it, but it starts to matter, then people will improve that data. So I think there's huge opportunity there for that sort of collaboration. It's made much easier if you have the top-down reform to align things, but actually just by sharing data and human beings collaborating about what matters, I think there's opportunity to make substantial improvement there.
Yeah, I suppose it's sharing that information, that sort of P&L, and having an understanding of the real railway and a willingness to challenge the data and make sure that everyone is on board with it to provide evidence that can drive decision making. That it's really helpful as sharing it, as you say, Network Rail, GBR, and throughout the industry. Thank you.
That's right. I think it's a general data to drive those conversations. Is incredibly powerful. Just those two examples around understanding the customer and what they care about, and understanding the combined P&L. It enables very much richer conversations that can actually lead to action, and people can find a way of doing it, even if the organisation structures aren't necessarily aligned.
Thank you. Paul, you play a lead role in the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network. Can you tell us a bit about your view around the need for increased long-term investment in R&I in rail, and what you think the impact of that would be?
Sure. I think this is always really hard when the industry is a challenging time. It's always difficult to get people to look further ahead into the future and to make a case for funding about making things better in the future when the basics aren't as they should be. And clearly there's some aspects of the railway at the moment where the basics aren't good enough, and so that's certainly difficult at the moment, but it's always difficult. It's more difficult at the moment, but we have to find a way of breaking into that, and I do see the opportunity with reform as being important there. We have a railway technical strategy which is relatively mature now. It's been through several iterations, but the opportunity is with a new guiding mind that for them to really own and develop that and advocate it and use it consistently. And if as with the data, if you use it consistently, then it gets more quality input to it, and it becomes better quality and more useful as a prioritization tool. So I think that's really key. And as part of that, if there's lots of great innovations around the place, and actually demonstrating the value of those, proving the benefit of it, it's not just for 20 years away, it's for improving things now. That's what helps to make the case for further investment. But what you need is a reasonably stable and consistent pipeline of funding so that people can invest in that, people in the supply chain as well as people in universities. So I'd certainly start with GBR owning the technical strategy, owning funding of research and innovation, bringing that together in a coordinated way, because there are several different parts of that in the industry at the moment, doing things not quite in isolation, but not necessarily joined up. And then we have UKRIN, UK Rail Research and Innovation Network, which I'm the academic lead for, which is 20 universities and about the same number of industrial partners. So that has been quite a loose network to date, but it could play a stronger coordinating role as a partner for GBR to really make sure we're getting the best of whatever funding there is, making the case for more funding by demonstrating its value, making sure that the funding that is available goes to the best most relevant academics in those different institutions. So being a one-stop shop route to that for GBR and others, but also making the case overseas for what UK rail research is available and advocating that internationally, so that then other international players can come not just to one institution such as mine, but to UKRIN, and we can actually establish, well, what's the best way of helping this. So I do think it's important, but it needs to be seen to be important at the top levels of the industry. And unless that happens, it's always going to be a struggle.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of sharing the successes of that R&I to really demonstrate the benefits will cause other people to get on board. As you say, you've got a strategy, but it's actually looking at specific examples. Finally, a question before we wrap up. If we get this right, what does a more financially sustainable rail system look like in, say, 10 years? And what are the first steps that we need to take to do that? You've alluded to some already, but just in summary.
Okay, so to start with, we have to get the basics right. The industry has to get the basics right. Its credibility depends upon that. And at the moment, that's compromised by there being too many delays and cancellations, which are in many cases explainable, but customers don't want that explanations. They want a reliable service. So I think that's the fundamental to start with. Beyond that, I think there's lots can be done to improve customer experience. Not all of which, as I said earlier, requires spending a lot of money. A lot of it is about the mindset. So I'd like to think that in 10 years, we've moved on from that being an important part of the narrative, which it is now, to it being really embedded in how everybody thinks. And it's really truly the case that all the activities are aligned to actually what customers want, because that is what ultimately is what will enable the wider economic benefits to non-users and to the environment, actually by making sure we've got that really embedded customer thinking. And in 10 years, I'd like to think as well, the industry's regained its track record, if you like, of delivering projects successfully. And there's a wider understanding that where the costs might seem high in some cases that's not acceptable and not good reasons, but in other cases it's because we've made choices. We as a nation have made choices that we want railways to be done in a certain way in terms of the amount of environmental mitigation, or in terms of the routing, or in terms of the social aspects, whatever. There are reasons for that, and I think we need to make sure those are better understood. So getting the basics right, improving the experience, building the track record. I'd like to think that in 10 years that could happen. There is a consensus about the direction of travel on reform. That's great, but it's only great if it happens. And I do think that if, as said earlier, if there was an empowered chief executive and chair appointed to shape GPR and to start to make it happen, then we could see progress relatively quickly, and certainly within that time horizon, we'd expect to see substantial improvement. The reality, of course, is that railways will always be subject to reform and change and in a spotlight. That's just the reality. So maybe in another 10 years, there will be another cycle, because we go through cycle. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we've delivered the benefits from what I think can be a significant reform.
Thank you, Paul. I think that sums it up. A big thank you to Paul for sharing his insights today. And thanks to you, the audience, for tuning in and joining us. Goodbye. Thank you.